You are already growing food. You understand soil. You understand seasons. You have put in the hours that most people never will. And I'm about to tell you that there is one plant you are almost certainly not growing that could be the most valuable thing on your entire property. Not because it yields the most, not because it's the easiest, because of what it produces, and what is happening right now to the system that currently produces it for the rest of the world. In 2025, the American honeybee industry suffered the single worst collapse in recorded history. Not a bad season, not a regional problem, a systemic catastrophe. 1.6 million hives wiped out between June 2024 and March 2025. 62% of commercial colonies gone. $600 million in direct losses. While beekeepers across the country described their phones ringing non-stop with farmers asking the same desperate question. Got any extra bees? Got any extra bees? One operator in Southern California, a man who has managed 25,000 colonies for years, lost more than half of them in a single season. He said something quietly that should echo through every homestead in this country. There's only so many hits you can take before you start saying, I don't know if I can keep doing this. And here is why that sentence matters to you specifically. Bees pollinate crops worth $18 billion annually in the United States alone. Globally, nearly $200 billion in food production depends on them. The almonds, the blueberries, the cherries, the apples, the avocados, the cucumbers. The list of crops that require bee pollination reads like a produce aisle inventory. When the colonies collapse, the prices climb, the yields shrink. The supply chain that the rest of the world depends on starts showing cracks that most people won't even know to connect back to an empty hive box sitting in a California orchard. You grow your own food. So you already understand something most people don't, that depending entirely on a system you don't control is a vulnerability, not a convenience. But here's the question I want you to sit with right now. What are you using to sweeten things? Because if the answer is commercial honey, or refined sugar, or anything that comes off a grocery store shelf, you still have a gap in your self-sufficiency that almost nobody in this space is talking about. And the solution has been growing wild in the mountains of South Africa for millions of years, sitting in the scientific record since 1705, and quietly waiting for someone with your exact skill set to finally give it a corner of their property. It costs $5 to $20 to start. It thrives in your worst soil. It needs almost no water once established. It produces a golden syrup that substitutes directly for honey in any recipe you know, with 0 bees required. And it contains a set of bioactive compounds that no commercial sweetener on earth combines in the same natural package. It is called Honeybush. And by the time this video ends, you are going to understand exactly why you've never heard of it, and exactly how to grow it yourself. Stay with me, because this one is going to change how you see your property. Before I tell you how to grow it, I need you to understand what you're actually dealing with. Because honeybush is not just an interesting plant, it is one of the most scientifically documented natural sweeteners on Earth, with a history that stretches back thousands of years before any laboratory got involved. Honeybush, scientific name Cyclopia, is a genus of 23 known species found in exactly one place on the planet, the Fynbos biome at the southern tip of South Africa. This is not a plant that spread across continents. It evolved in one of the most extraordinary and isolated ecosystems on Earth and stayed there. The Cape Floristic region, the area where honeybush grows, is one of only 6 floral kingdoms on the entire planet. Here is the scale of that. All of North America, all of Europe, nay, and all of Northern Asia combined make up just one floral kingdom. This small stretch of South African coastline is an entire kingdom by itself. It contains roughly 9,000 plant species. Nearly 70% of those species are found nowhere else on Earth. More endemic plant species than many entire continents. UNESCO declared it a World Heritage Site. It is smaller than Portugal and holds more plant diversity than the United Kingdom, Germany, and France combined. And right there in that landscape, in acidic, nutrient-poor, sandy soil that would kill most garden plants within weeks, grows a woody shrub with bright yellow flowers. Crush a leaf between your fingers, and it smells unmistakably like honey. Brew its stems, and you taste honey. Process its flowers and leaves into a concentrated syrup, and you pour a golden liquid that goes into any recipe calling for honey and works. 0 caffeine, 0 tannins, virtually no sugar in its tea form, and 3 bioactive compounds that no other widely available sweetener on Earth delivers together in the same natural package. The first is mangiferin. A study published in 2017 described it as a miracle bioactive compound, documenting its antioxidant, antimicrobial, anti-diabetic, anti-allergic, and immunomodulatory properties. One compound doing work that most pharmaceutical companies would spread across 6 different drugs. The second is hesperidin, a flavonone with documented anti-inflammatory effects that researchers have linked to potential cancer-fighting ability. The third is pinitol, and this one is the remarkable one. Pinitol mimics the action of insulin inside the human body. A study published in the British Journal of Pharmacology documented this directly. It helps cells absorb glucose from the bloodstream without requiring additional insulin production. For the more than 400 million people worldwide living with diabetes, that is not a curiosity. That is a molecule worth knowing about. A 12-week clinical study involving 120 participants showed honeybush extract significantly improved skin measurements compared to placebo. An animal study found unfermented honeybush tea reduced esophageal cancer size by 94% in the study model. Researchers have documented bone health support, liver protection, antimicrobial effects, and gut health benefits from this single plant. One plant, a pharmacy's worth of potential sitting in its stems and leaves. And the entire global honeybush market is worth approximately $10 million. The world spends more on chewing gum in a single afternoon. This is how invisible it still is, despite being in the scientific record for over 300 years. Here is the history piece that puts all of this in sharp focus. The people who understood honeybush best were not scientists. They were the Khoisan, the indigenous people of South Africa's Cape region, among the oldest continuous human populations on Earth. Genetic evidence suggests they have inhabited southern Africa for at least 30,000 years. For centuries, possibly millennia, they harvested honeybush from wild stands in the mountains. They used it for respiratory ailments, digestive support after difficult meals, recovery after childbirth, skin conditions, joint inflammation. They gave it to children, they gave it to elders. The locations of the best wild stands were family secrets, guarded as carefully as any written formula. The preparation methods were refined through centuries of direct observation. This was not casual foraging. This was a sophisticated pharmacological tradition built and validated across thousands of years of human experience. Then European colonizers arrived. The Dutch East India Company established a base at what would become Cape Town in 1652. European botanists documented honeybush as early as 1705. They saw it, they noted it, and then they moved on. Because the colonial economy had no framework for valuing a wild mountain shrub, they brought European honeybees instead. They built commercial apiaries, and they imposed their own model of sweetness onto the region and eventually onto the global market. The Khoisan knowledge was not destroyed, but it was pushed so far to the margins that for over 200 years, one of the most remarkable natural sweeteners in the southern hemisphere sat in the mountains producing its compounds in silence, while the world built an entire industry around a completely different system, a system that required bees, a system that is now collapsing. If this is already reshaping how you're thinking about what belongs on your homestead, subscribe right now. This channel exists for exactly this moment, the one where something you've never heard of suddenly makes more sense than almost anything you have. Hit subscribe and the bell. The next video is already coming and you don't want to find it 3 months late. Iko. Now let's talk about actually growing this, because this is where it gets interesting for someone who already works the land. Everything you think you know about giving a plant what it needs, set it aside for a moment. Honeybush does not want your best bed. It does not want your compost-rich raised garden. It does not want regular feeding or careful watering or the attention you give your tomatoes. It wants your worst corner. Here is the biology of why that matters. And this is the part most people miss completely. When a plant is under environmental stress, it produces higher concentrations of secondary metabolites. These are the chemical compounds it generates for protection and survival. They are the molecules responsible for flavor, aroma, and medicinal properties. Under stress, the plant stops putting energy into lush leaf growth and starts concentrating everything into its chemical defenses. In honeybush, those chemical defenses are mangiferin, hesperidin, and pinitol, the exact compounds that make this plant worth growing. Stress is not a problem to manage here. Stress is the mechanism that produces the harvest you actually want. Rich soil gives you a big green bush and a weak, flavorless, medicinally hollow harvest. Poor soil, sandy, acidic, fast-draining, gives you everything the research documents. This is the first real inversion this plant asks of you. The discipline is not more care, it is deliberate restraint. And if you've been growing food long enough, you already know that restraint is actually harder than attention. You have the instinct to help things. This plant needs you to resist that instinct. For anyone in USDA Zones 8 through 11, honeybush grows outdoors year-round without any protection. It tolerates temperatures down to about -6 or 7 degrees Celsius before needing cover. If your winters drop harder than that, containers are your answer. Large pots, poor sandy mix, full summer sun outside, moved indoors before the first hard frost. The plant adapts without complaint. The watering rule is simple and non-negotiable. Let the soil dry out completely between waterings. Not mostly dry, completely dry. These roots evolved to plunge deep into the earth, searching for hidden groundwater during brutal African summer droughts. Let them do what millions of years built them to do. The moment you start watering on a schedule out of habit, Not you are working against the plant's chemistry. No fertilizer, ever. Not slow release, not compost tea. Nothing. Fertilizer pushes leaf growth at the direct expense of the compounds you're growing this plant for. Feed it, and you've wasted your $20. No pesticide either. And this one you get for free. The same polyphenols that make honeybush medicinally valuable make it naturally resistant to pests and disease. They simply leave it alone. This is a plant that defends itself, which means one less thing on your list. Getting started is straightforward. A single honeybush plant from a specialty nursery runs $5 to $20. That is your entire startup cost. No suit, no hive boxes, no chemical treatments, no extractors. The average hobby beekeeper spends well over $1,000 before seeing their first jar of honey. You are looking at $20 and a neglected corner. On species, the one worth knowing is Cyclopia intermedia, called mountain tea. It produces the richest and most prized sweetness and accounts for 85% of the wild harvest. Cyclopia subternata, valley tea, has become one of the easier species to cultivate commercially and is a reliable choice for backyard growing. Start with whichever your nursery carries from either of those two. Propagation from semi-hardwood cuttings taken in late summer is your fastest and most reliable route. Basic rooting hormone, a well-draining mix, patience for a few weeks. One plant becomes 10 within a few years. 10 becomes 50. You scale as slowly or as quickly as your space allows. Seeds are possible, but slower and more demanding. Honeybush seeds evolved in a fire-dependent ecosystem, or their coating is so hard that without intervention they will sit dormant in soil for years, sometimes decades, waiting for the chemical signal of a wildfire to trigger germination. You replicate that signal two ways. Physical scarification. Scratch the seed coat firmly with sandpaper until you've broken through the outer armor, or smoke water. Soak the seeds in water infused with wood smoke, replicating the chemical cue the plant evolved to recognize. Either method works. Cuttings bypass all of it, which is why most experienced growers start there and never look back. First-year growth is slow, regardless of how you start. The plant is not being lazy. It is building a root system deep and wide enough to sustain decades of production. That year of patience buys you a plant that will still be producing on your property long after your other annuals have cycled through 100 times. After 1 to 2 years, you have a plant that asks almost nothing and gives back every season. When harvest time arrives, the process is worth understanding completely, because this is where the chemistry actually happens, and rushing it costs you the very thing you're growing this plant for. Cut only 1/3 of the branches per harvest, never more. Leave the majority of the plant intact so it regenerates quickly and keeps producing. If you've ever harvested perennial herbs, the same principle applies here, just applied with more discipline. Take those fresh cuttings and bruise them, not aggressively, just enough to crack the stems and break the plant cell walls slightly, releasing the internal compounds that drive fermentation. Then bundle the material, cover it to retain warmth, and leave it alone for 3 to 5 days. This is oxidative fermentation, the same principle behind processing tea leaves applied to a different plant with different chemistry. Watch what happens during those days. The bright green foliage fades slowly into a deep mahogany brown. The smell shifts. What was green and vegetal becomes unmistakably, almost shockingly, honey. That aroma is your signal. The process is working. The compounds are concentrating. After fermentation is complete, spread the material thin and dry it in the sun for 1 to 2 days. Dried properly, it stores indefinitely in airtight containers. You can brew it directly from this point as a naturally sweet tea. 0 calories, 0 caffeine. All those compounds dissolved into every cup. But the honey substitute, the golden syrup that replaces what you currently buy, requires one more step that anyone with a kitchen can do in an afternoon. Simmer the dried material in water. 1 part plant material to 4 parts water. Gentle heat, not a rolling boil, a gentle simmer. Maintained for 1 to 2 hours while the sweet compounds extract fully into the liquid. Strain everything through a fine mesh until the liquid runs clear. Then continue reducing over low heat, slowly, watching the consistency thicken until it moves like syrup when you tilt the pot. What you pour into the jar is golden. It looks like honey. It carries a flavor that most people recognize immediately as honey-like, though with its own distinct character that is entirely its own. It stores at room temperature without spoiling or crystallizing. It goes into baking, into dressings, into your morning routine, into any recipe that currently calls for honey. Your equipment list is a pot, a strainer, and a heat source. That is it. That is the entire processing operation. One thing worth saying clearly because it matters more than hype. Honeybush syrup is not chemically identical to bee honey. Bee honey is primarily fructose and glucose produced through enzymatic processing inside a honeybee's body. Honeybush syrup derives its sweetness from a complex mixture of polyphenols and natural plant sugars. In most countries, it cannot legally be labeled as honey because regulatory definitions require bee involvement. What it accurately is, a natural plant-based sweetener with a honey-like flavor, not a documented set of bioactive compounds that commercial bee honey does not contain, produced entirely on your property from a plant that costs less than a bag of potting mix to start. In some ways, the distinction makes it more interesting, not less. Now, here is the part of this story that most coverage skips past, and it's the part that I think matters most to someone with a homestead mindset. Right now, approximately 80% of all honeybush on the commercial market is being unsustainably wild harvested from natural stands in South Africa. Every commercial Cyclopia species appears on the IUCN Red List of threatened species. The entire global production of honeybush is approximately 400 tons per year, enough to make about 1 cup of tea per week for a few 100,000 people. The entire global supply of one of the most extraordinary plants on Earth, invisible against the $10 billion global honey market. The natural stands that have sustained this plant for millions of years are being stripped faster than they can recover. Illegal harvesting, urbanization, invasive species, inappropriate fire management. The mountain ecosystems of South Africa are under pressure from every direction simultaneously. Every plant grown outside of South Africa is direct pressure removed from those wild stands. Every jar of syrup you produce on your homestead is a jar that didn't require someone walking into a protected mountain range and cutting something that took decades to establish. This is where your property becomes something larger than a property. You are not just adding a crop, or you are participating in the preservation of a plant that the world is only beginning to properly understand. 321 years after it first appeared in the scientific record, and thousands of years after the Khoisan people figured out what it was capable of and built an entire pharmacological tradition around it. a tradition that was marginalized by colonial agriculture that had no interest in learning from people it had already decided to dismiss. That knowledge survived anyway. The science has now caught up to what those communities knew from direct experience across thousands of years of observation. And now it's your turn to carry it forward from a corner of your property that was probably doing nothing anyway. Subscribe right now if you want to follow where this channel goes next, because every video here is another plant, on another system, another piece of knowledge that got bypassed or buried or simply never made it past the ecosystem it came from. You've made it this far. That tells me you're exactly the kind of person this content is made for. Subscribe and hit the bell. Don't find the next one 3 months late. Here is where I want